Hello and welcome. You are watching Lockdown TV from UnHerd. Today we have a special guest, Rutger Bregman, who joins us from Holland. He is a writer, historian, and has just published a new book called Humankind. Welcome, Rutger. Can you hear me?
Thanks. Yes, I can hear you very well.
So let's get straight into your new book and the big idea here, which is that essentially contra Thomas Hobbes, contra the Lord of the Flies, your view is that human nature is a good thing and that people, as you put it, are fundamentally decent.
Yes, exactly. I wouldn't say that people are naturally good. I mean, we're clearly not angels. We have all kinds of nasty sides. We're capable of pretty horrible aggression and jealousy. And you could even argue that in some ways we're the cruelest species in the whole animal kingdom. We do things that no other species would dream of doing. Wars and the cleansing, etc., etc. The core, we have evolved to be friendly, and that this is really our true superpower, that we can just cooperate on a scale that no other species can. So yes, the central message of the book is that deep down, most people are pretty decent.
So this, I think, has a lot of interesting philosophical questions, which I want to come to. But just to start with something quite specific, the Black Lives Matter movement that is, all over America and Europe at the moment. How does that play into this kind of bigger theory? So do you see it as an expression of this goodness, or how do you understand it in that context?
Well, it seems to me that those at the top want us to believe right now that civilization is only a very thin veneer, and that we need to bring in the police and the army to bring law and order. Right? And this theory, veneer theory, as scientists call it, have been used so often and for so long now to justify hierarchy and oppression. While if you really look at what's going on, it's actually millions of protesters, the vast majority of protesters who are protesting peacefully, while some of the really savage behavior is actually from the police, from those who are supposed to establish law and order. They're actually the ones bringing anarchy. So it's upside down.
So are you in favor of defunding the police?
Well, if you look at the US, it seems a sensible place to start, right? The United States spends an extraordinary amount of money on guard labor, on police, on the army, et cetera, while spent much less in European countries on social security. Well, I'll think, what a good police officer in the 21st century should be is something of a social worker. You should know the grandmothers and the granddads and the aunts and the uncles of a neighborhood, right? You should really try and make friends with those in the neighborhood so that they can be your allies if you want to do something about serious crime. This is called community policing, and we have a much stronger tradition of that in many Western European countries, especially in Scandinavia. And that's all about, well, in many ways, turning the other cheek and assuming the best, even in those that you don't trust, in the criminals. And if you do look at the results of community policing and also the prisons that you then start designing, it has much better results. So Norway, for example, has the lowest recidivism rates in the whole world, the lowest chance that someone will commit another crime after he or she gets out of prison. Many guards and also police officers in the streets don't even carry weapons. Because, what's the message of showing up in riot gear? If you're at a peaceful protest and then you show up in riot gear, what's the message of that? There's been a lot of talk about the importance of nonviolence, but maybe we should talk about the importance of the state actually being nonviolent and committing to that ideal.
It kind of hits on a central philosophical question, which I have, which is, and this is in a way what separates kind of right radicals from left radicals, is that, some degree of order is required, isn't it, in order for that goodness to have a chance to show itself. And a full state of anarchy is not a happy place to be. So in other words, those hierarchies and those structures, even if they're local and homegrown, are part of the kind of genius of humankind, and that to smash them down actually makes life worse for everybody.
This has been the assumption for so long, especially by those in power, is that order is something that has to be created, and that we people in our natural state, that we are these violent savages. And that's the idea that I really take issue with in the book. I, for example, look at nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes that are often painted in terms of, that they're these violent people who really had to be tamed by civilization. But actually, the recent archaeological and anthropological evidence points in a very different direction. I know that, it's hard to know exactly how people lived 20, 30,000 years ago, right? The evidence we have is thin. But what we have points in the direction that actually nomadic hunter-gatherers lived in these relatively peaceful societies, quite egalitarian. And that the first strong evidence we see for war, in the archaeological record, actually starts when people became sedentary and they settled down and they established these hierarchies and they invented patriarchy and generals and kings arise. So I think that our reading of history has often been, well, as I said, upside down, and that in many cases, for the biggest part of the history of civilization, it was actually civilization that was the problem. Now, why don't we know that, or why have you forgotten about that? Because we've made such extraordinary progress in the last couple of decades, moral progress, technological progress. But the vast majority of the history of civilization, ever from the invention of agriculture to, say, the French Revolution, so a period of around 10,000 years, was actually a disaster for most people, who were bonded to some rich landlord and just had to work on the land 60, 70 hours a week and live these pretty terrible lives.
The curse of civilization, most people, I think, listening to that will immediately think of some of the great achievements of civilization, whether it's, Chartres Cathedral or, Paris or the Natural History Museum or whatever your favorite thing is, and it's religious or secular. But the great achievements of humankind have come out of the great civilizations, haven't they? I mean, where do they fit into your curse of civilization narrative?
Well, what you see, or what we still have, are the pyramids, but you tend to forget the thousands or tens of thousands of people who were forced to work there as slaves, right? And that these pyramids were actually some of these hugely ambitious schemes to pay tribute to some kind of I don't know, the Donald Trumps of our history, and we've had many of them. So you have to remember that history is written by the victors, and so the sources reflect that. And in our history books, and you see this, from the very first text we have, is that those others, the savages, are always described as the people who need to be tamed and need to be civilized. I mean, that's literally what the Greeks said. The barbarians are all those who are not Greek. But then if you zoom out a little bit and if you look at these sources with a critical eye, then I think you'll actually realize that this state of civilization was actually, for the vast majority of people, was really horrible. So just to give a couple of examples. In the first place, we find that these societies tend to start engaging in wars, which is obviously not a wonderful thing. And in the second place, you get these outbreaks of infection diseases and epidemics once people start to live too closely to one another. So measles and plague and malaria, these are all civilized diseases. I mean, COVID-19 is a product of civilization. There are stronger hierarchies. You could argue that it was the invention of patriarchy as well. So that is really the picture you get. And it's also what you realize if you look at all those milestones of civilization, like writing, for example. The first texts were not sort of like a wonderful romantic poetry, but was just accounting to keep account of all kinds of debts that people had, or the first judicial texts. What do you find in there? Well, for example, the kind of punishment slaves should get when they flee. The first states were all slave states. So again, I mean, I'm not saying we should go back and live as nomadic hunter-gatherers. That's obviously not the case. But I do think it's important to have a more realistic view of our history. Also to just appreciate how much progress we've made in just a very short period of time in the past, say 50 years, basically.
So, but I'm just trying to get my head around this alternative world, the Rutger Bregman world, where the evils of civilization had never happened. Presumably, there'd be no pyramids, there'd be no cathedrals, there'd be no boulevards in Paris, they may not be writing. And if writing is a bad thing, there'd be no book from Rutger
I'm not
Bregman.
saying it's a bad thing. It's a technology, obviously, and technology can be used for multiple purposes. But I am saying that so many of these milestones of civilization actually arose as in the first place as tools of oppression, and that's how often they've been used.
So if it doesn't mean that you want to return us to hunter-gatherer mode, what do you want us to do? I mean, how do we apply this practically to the modern world?
Okay, so what we first should realize is that our view of human nature tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if we assume that most people can't be trusted, that deep down we're just selfish, then we'll design our society around that idea. And we'll start building the kind of schools and democracies and workplaces that I think will tend to bring out the worst in each and every one of us. We can turn it around. If we design our institutions around a more realistic view of who we are, then I think we can move to a more egalitarian world, a more genuinely democratic world, where people have more freedom to follow their intrinsic motivation. And in the second half of my book, I just go over a lot of practical case studies, because I think this really needs to be made practical and not just, you can't come up with blueprints for every part of society. But just look at practical case studies of people who've already done this. What would a school look like if you don't have to rely on, strong hierarchy anymore, where you actually trust the kids to follow their own learning pathway and develop their curiosity? Well, there are places where people have tried this. It turns out it works really well.
In the political sphere, you have some ideas in the book about kind of hyperlocal democratic initiatives, which to me sounded almost a little bit Burkean, actually, these kind of little platoons popping up, where I guess you would sort of self-organize at a kind of village level or a hyperlocal level, and decisions would be made down there by whoever kind of gets involved. Is that what we should be going for?
Well, partly, but I think you can also scale it up. There's a strong tradition now and a lot of research since the 70s into so-called deliberative democracy. And the idea here is that we should move to a real democracy. What we have now is an elective aristocracy. So every 3 or 4 years, we're allowed to choose our own aristocrats. And there are very few people actually on the menu, right? There's often dynasties like the Bushes and the Kennedys and the Clintons. So you can sort of ask yourself the question, is that a real choice? Now, a real democracy, in the way that, the original Greek idea, how they thought it should be, was that, average citizens should become a politician, every now and then, that all of us should engage. Now, obviously, the Greeks didn't allow women and slaves to participate. So it's absolutely not a perfect model what they had. But it's important to remember that the original idea of democracy was very different from what we have now. Actually, if you read the texts of the founding fathers of the United States, you realize that they were very much against democracy, and that they designed the current system as a way to protect the interests of those who were already in power. They were very wary of the real democracy.
What you mean by real democracy is just that people participate more.
One old idea, so the Greek idea, is to randomly select people from the population every now and then to become a politician on the local level, on the provincial level, on the state level. For example, the first chamber in many countries could be randomly selected. Many people then assume, well, that wouldn't work because then, people are too stupid or lazy or whatever. Turns out, in these experiments, if you bring people together, whether they're left wing or right wing, rich, poor, young, old, around the table, you give them access to experts and high quality information, and you let them have, discussions about really difficult subjects and controversial subjects, whether it's drugs or the level of taxation or racism or whatever, and you let them discuss it. Almost every time they come up with sensible compromises. Now, why don't we know this? Because often these experiments with deliberative democracy, well, the press hates them. Why? Because it looks really boring. It's just people having a rational discussion while they're drinking coffee. That's basically what it looks like. So there was one television program in the 90s called The People's Parliament. This was in the UK. And Channel 4 aired it for one season, just 100 people completely randomly selected from the population discussing difficult things. And it turns out that the discussion, according to The Economist at the time, the discussions were much better than, the discussions in Parliament. But Channel 4 pulled the plug after one season because it was just too boring and the ratings weren't high enough.
Right. So I mean, in a sense, doesn't that example show the weakness of this vision? Because if people weren't interested enough to watch it, they're not interested enough to take part. And I hear this a lot with politicians, actually. You know, they always want more people to be engaged in politics. But the truth is that most people are quite happy not engaging in politics. And actually, if you push things down to a kind of hyperlocal participative democracy, what you'd end up getting in reality are the busybodies who have time and want to kind of inject themselves in everyone's affairs, running the show and being the kind of local tyrants, and that you'd have to constantly be fighting them back in order just to keep the situation normal. So isn't that the problem, that actually people really enjoy the fact that they delegate the administration of the state upwards to a power that they can just think about once every 5 years and otherwise forget about?
It's a great question. I think that apathy is often a result of the system which we live. It's not something that, I mean, if you're a kid or like a baby or a toddler is like naturally curious, wants to explore the world, but then somehow it happens that as we grow older, we maybe lose our intrinsic motivation and our curiosity. We lose something that was there at birth or where we were kids, but then after a while it's gone. You see something similar in factory farming, right? You have these chickens in factory farms, and I recently spoke to a man who bought a couple of chickens from a factory farm, and he put them in his own garden, and these chickens, they didn't do anything, right? They were just standing still because that's the kind of creatures they made. It took them weeks before they started moving again. So it will be a journey to move to a more active, a more participatory democracy. But I think it can be done.
It's not assuming they're stupid. I mean, I feel like people like you and me who like talking and thinking about politics and ideas and stuff all the time, you know, we might love a highly participative democracy. We can all kind of argue about things every day. But people who don't want to think about stuff like that every day, it's not that they're lazy or battery chickens. They just prefer to think about their family or about what they're going to create in their day and about the important things in life that give them meaning. That actually the kind of administrative aspects of running a state or a village or whatever it is are quite boring. And it's quite a relief to delegate that to someone else. So you can just get on with the joyful aspects of life.
Well, if you look at the judicial system in the US, where people are already randomly selected to participate in a jury, I think that works relatively well, at least way better than you would assume if you would have a more cynical view of human nature. So I think the idea here is to just expand that. And sure, there will be some people who don't like it, but just imagine that we have a world where almost everyone would know someone who has been or is a politician at some point in time, right? Where just it's much more a natural thing, and where it's also much more regulating, where people are not they don't become career politicians for like 30 or 40 years, and that you get these dynasties that I mentioned earlier. But that it circulates much more. I think that's also a good way to control the corruption of power. We know that power is an incredibly dangerous drug. It damages your empathy. And clearly the current democratic model is not very clear or very effective at controlling those kind of psychological effects. Now, I must say, I mean, I absolutely agree with you that there are great challenges here. I just think it's a really promising direction of thought that it deserves to be scaled up.
I actually agree with you on the kind of jury model. I actually wrote a piece once saying that we should turn the House of Lords into a randomly selected body. So I do think that is an interesting idea. But actually, ironically, it's kind of a Hobbesian idea. I mean, Hobbes is your big villain in this book, who you're disagreeing with. But his whole principle, as I understand it in Leviathan, is that he's almost less interested whether the person you delegate power to is a monarch or a parliament or almost randomly selected. The key principle is that you delegate the power to administrate and take decisions so that you can get on with your life in peace. So maybe you've gone full circle here and become a Hobbesian.
Well, I like that. I'm all open to that. Don't worry about it. What I really criticize in the book is sort of the Hobbesian view of our state of nature as being, just just savage and violent. He talked about this war of all against all that was going on, and that only when we had, chosen our Leviathan and we had given up our liberty in favor of security, that finally, things became better. And I obviously then talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who made the opposite point, who said that, no, actually, our state of nature was pretty good and civilization was the terrible decision. And to me, it was just fascinating to realize that if you go over the latest evidence from anthropology and archaeology, that actually Rousseau was more realistic.
This to me seems a real echo between right and left. Again, I keep seeing them, and actually your book was one of those that actually change a few sentences and change a few thoughts, and it could be written by a kind of a right radical as opposed to a left radical. I mean, those groups would be united against the kind of sort of liberal orthodoxy, big business and all of these massive structures that are kind of running the world. And they also, the kind of right radicals, will also want to see a return to these kind of more natural local cultures and ways of organizing things. The big distinction, as I see it, is whether you kind of are allowed to defend the particular or not. And your vision seems a kind of universalist vision. Your previous book, Utopia for Realists, talked about a kind of borderless world. And that's where the left and right finally disagree, that the kind of right-leaning equivalent of Rutger Bregman thinks 75% of the same, but he or she then thinks you've got to be allowed to defend and love and protect your own family, your own village, your own country, and treat it differently to everybody else.
Well, I would totally agree that you're allowed to love your own friends and family in your own country, and I very much do so. But I think our identity should be like a house built on strong foundations, so that when you have that, you can just open the windows, right? And not be afraid of the rest of the world and just, explore and see what else is out there. I think that often people who have weak identities and are a bit more insecure, don't really know who they are, they tend to be more xenophobic and, worry more about those other people far away who are destroying our culture. It's interesting, though, what you mentioned about some overlap between left-wing and right-wing thinking. My previous book, Utopia for Realists, was obviously about one of the main ideas in there was universal basic income. It's a monthly grant, enough to pay for your basic needs, food, shelter, clothing, so that we can completely eradicate poverty. So it's left-wing in the sense that, you would need to raise quite some taxes in order to finance the whole thing. And you'd eradicate poverty, so the left will like that. But then it's quite right-wing in the sense that it's about individual freedom and giving everyone a little bit of venture capital to start their own company and make their own choices in their lives. So it is often those ideas that move beyond the old-fashioned distinction between the left and the right that I find myself interested in. And I often also have the feeling that, just look at the history of the 20th century. Aren't like capitalism and communism, haven't they often been two sides of the same beast, where you get the same hierarchical, patriarchal models with the same, corruption of power going on there?
The universal basic income that you just mentioned is an interesting example of this, because it's very popular on kind of Silicon Valley, West Coast, by these kind of libertarian techno-utopians who basically, it seems to me, want to have the entire world using their platforms and products and just being paid a kind of monthly stipend to behave rather like those battery chickens you talked about earlier. And it's, a world where you just get paid to do nothing and it makes no difference whether you work or not. Seems like a very bleak, quite depressing place to be. To me.
I would see that very differently. I don't think that people will behave in such a way if you give them a bit of basic income. The evidence we have is that actually people have a lot of ideas of what they want to do with their lives. I think that inherently human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. We want to do something. We want to contribute in a way. The tragedy of the current system is that, according to some recent evidence we have from a study from 2018 by two Dutch economists, who found that 25% of people think that their job is pretty much meaningless. And then you look at those jobs, these socially meaningless jobs, and it turns out that, they're not the garbage collectors, not the teachers, not the nurses, but actually people with wonderful resumes who went to great Ivy League universities, who are earning a lot of money, but then at the end of the day say, my job is absolutely meaningless. I think that a basic income would be liberating in many ways. So in the first place, it would give young people the option to do something different because they have this venture capital. They can study something that, where it's not immediately clear how they're, going to earn their money, but they can just experiment for a while. And in the second place, a basic income will cause a redistribution of power, because if you have a basic income, you can always fall back on it. The garbage collectors, the teachers, the nurses. So they'll have much more bargaining power, which means that they can go on strike easier, so their wages will have to go up. Now, if you have a socially meaningless job, you can go on strike, but no one cares because no one really notices. In my previous book, I had an example of a banker strike in 1970 in Ireland. The strike lasted for 6 months and people didn't really care. The economy just kept growing. And then the bankers came back and said, all right, we'll get back to work. So I think that in the long run, introducing a basic income for everyone will, cause also sort of a redistribution of respect, where we sort of have a different valuation of the different jobs that we do in our societies. So, I'm actually quite hopeful that it will move in exactly the opposite direction of what you described.
So I guess the central difference then between us is, your critique of the Enlightenment and the kind of overly rational dominance since that period, I would share. But to me, things like universal basic income sound overly rational. They seem like they fly in the face of kind of lived experience and how people find meaning. Meaningful work is quite hard to do if everyone just gets paid to do nothing. Let me ask another example about that.
Well, just one thing, though. I mean, we've got evidence since the 1970s of dozens of experiments around the globe where people have actually tried, a basic income. We recently have an experiment from Finland. And it's very funny to me how that's been described in the press, because what they found is that actually in the last report is that, no, people don't massively quit their jobs. They don't turn out to be massively lazy or anything like that. Actually, there was a slight positive effect on the amount of work hours worked. But then it was described as, it's a failure because it doesn't let people work more. But then I'm like, that's shifting the goalposts. I mean, the initial argument that people would all stop working if you give them a basic income, then that doesn't happen at all. Actually, a little bit of the opposite happens, and then people say, it doesn't work. Well, we've got a huge amount of evidence, empirical evidence from good, sound research that basic income causes healthcare costs to go down, crime to go down, kids do better in school. There's a lot of positive results. Now, I think we need more evidence. We need more experiments. We need to scale it up and then see what happens, right? You got to don't think in blueprints, but keep, practicing and see what happens. But I think the evidence is really on the side of those who are the advocates here of a basic income.
So let me throw another one at you, which is the family. This is another interesting point of difference. In the book, you talk about some of these kind of pre-civilized societies where, the elders looked after all the children indiscriminately, and that things started going wrong when there was this sense of kind of, I look after my people and not your people. Do you stand by that? Is it part of the vision to kind of rethink the structure of the family, or where does that fit into your thinking?
Oh, that's a really good question, because it's funny, I'm a married man, so I live in this boring provincial town called Houten that many conservatives will like, because nothing ever happens here. And then indeed, if you look at the evidence we have from nomadic hunter-gatherers, you find a little bit of a different picture. Yeah. So, marriage does seem to exist, but the patriarchy as we know it from later periods in history, didn't really. You could argue that sort of nomadic hunter-gatherers were these proto-feminists, and there's quite some evidence from different tribes around the world. Then that question is obviously like, are these the model for how we lived 20, 30,000 years ago? There's a very long and complicated academic debate about that. But yeah, I mean, there seems to be.
In what sense were they proto-feminists?
It's really the equality here that is, I think, interesting. So in terms of decision making, in terms of also the sharing of work duties. So we really tend to think in hunters and gatherers, like men and women. Well, in quite some societies that was more mixed. But just basically in terms of who's in power in those kind of societies, and that when people become farmers and start living in cities, you really see this patriarchy developing, where basically the men are in power and women are, they become almost like cattle, right? They can be given away to another family for political purposes or whatever, and that's really not the case among most nomadic hunter tribes that we know. So that's actually interesting, and maybe we shouldn't tell this to all the Jordan Peterson fans out there. Is that actually it's in our nature to be some kind of feminist, but it's really what our evolutionary history suggests. There's also this new theory actually from biology, self-domestication theory, which suggests that over the millennia it was the friendliest among us, especially among the men who had the most kids and so had the biggest chance of passing on their genes. And you really see this within skeletons as well. So if you compare skeletons from 50, 40, 30, 20, 10,000 years ago, you see that they just start looking more feminine, right? It's the feminization even of men in our history. And that's been really important for us because this self-domestication, just the fact that we were selected for friendliness, has helped us to cooperate on a scale that other species just can't. So there are quite a few scientists now who believe that this is one of the reasons why we're still here and the Neanderthals or other hominid species are gone. It's because we have become what I like to call Homo puppy, right? We've become sort of very puppyish, and we've domesticated ourselves.
So you keep using this word patriarchy, and yet from what you describe, I mean, you're living in Holland, which is one of the most equal societies probably on Earth. There's been unbelievable progress on this.
Totally agree.
Decades. Why do you still keep talking about the patriarchy? Is that not, hasn't the systems you've just talked about got rid of the patriarchy already?
Well, I totally agree with you that we have made a huge amount of progress. It's just, but it's all very recent, and I still think we have some way to go. But yeah, I mean, no disagreement to when you make the statement that living in the Netherlands at the beginning of the 21st century is much better than almost any other place in the history of civilization.
Okay, let me ask you about one final theme here, Rutger, which is Christianity. So you are the son of a pastor. You had as I understand it, religious upbringing. And some of this last book almost seems like a kind of attempt to reject that. It feels like original sin, even though it's not something you talk about a lot, is part of what you're rejecting with the idea that humankind is good. Is that part of this narrative for you?
Well, it's funny that you put it like that, because I was recently doing this interview with a Guardian journalist who said, well, you've written a very Christian book, haven't you? Isn't this all a way to sort of still validate everything that your parents have taught you? I
was going to follow on with that.
I think both of these things are true. So there's a really fascinating theory from anthropology that, again, I mean, it's speculative and there's a lot of debate about it. But it's a theory about how we came to believe in these all-powerful, all-knowing gods who are up in the sky looking down on us and trying to basically control what we're doing, and who very much care about our sins. Now that's very different from the gods of nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes. Again, we've got a lot of ethnographic field reports from anthropologists who study tribes from around the globe, and there are some striking similarities if you look at their religions. They do believe in gods, but these gods are not very powerful. Often they only have some like local powers. They're often quite stupid, in many of these stories they make stupid mistakes. And they certainly don't care about your sins. I mean, why would you as a god care about who has sex with who? Like, who cares, right? You've got better things to do. But then this idea that gods actually do care and they're also very powerful and they can punish you for all kinds of things starts arising in these more civilized hierarchical societies. And the theory from some anthropologists is that this has everything to do with it's just the scale of these societies. We've obviously evolved for face-to-face contact. So we can look each other in the eyes. I can see you looking at me now through the camera. because you have white around your irises. With all the other primates, the bonobos, chimpanzees, the orangutans, they've got dark around their eyes, so it's hard to track their gazes. They're a little bit like poker players wearing shades. Now, with us humans, we can see what we're looking at, and this is called the cooperative eye hypothesis, and it has probably helped us in our evolution to work together. And it's maybe a bit of a part of this secret superpower that we have for cooperation. But then when we start living in larger groups and societies, obviously you can't see everyone anymore. You can't keep track of everyone anymore. So then we need to come up with a solution. And the theory is that then we basically organically invented God, someone up there to be on the lookout for each and every one of us. Now, luckily, we've now arrived in a world where we often don't need that kind of punitive, all-powerful God anymore, because we have the state, because we have the judicial system, we have human rights. And it's interesting, if you look at the correlation, actually, it's the countries with the strongest criminal justice system and the strongest most reliable states where people really trust their governments. It's that also sort of the belief in this all-powerful God is gone. So you find most atheists, you find them in Scandinavia. And I think a simple reason for that is that they just don't really need this all-powerful God anymore. Now, does that mean that we don't need any kind of religion at all anymore? Well, I think that already if you read the New Testament, then you can find, a different kind of at least parts of the New Testament, a kind of Christianity that is much more about, the better angels of our nature, about the power of turning the other cheek, instead of genocide and oppression and you name it. And that's very much the tradition in which I was brought up. So my father is not the kind of man who says, oh, this dogma is true and that dogma isn't true, and we should oppress those people who don't believe in me, et cetera, et cetera. For him, I think religion is more a form of poetry. It's about, developing your own life philosophy and helping other people. So often when I was 18, 19 years old, you obviously have to decide, especially as a son of a preacher, do I actually believe all of this? And then I was reading all these books by people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens with subtitles like How Religion Poisons Everything. And back then I already had this feeling like, well, this is clearly wrong. I mean, it can't poison everything. I mean, I know a lot of religious people who are actually quite wonderful. So as I became older, I became less interested in the question, is this true or is that true? Did Jesus die for my sins? Did God create the world? I think that intellectually those questions are a bit less interesting. And I'm more interested in the question, what would happen if people believe this? What happens if people believe that? Because so often our ideas are self-fulfilling prophecies and we become the stories that we tell ourselves. So yeah, I mean, if people are religious, then I just like to look at the effects of that, right? What's the English expression? The proof of the cake is in the pudding. Yeah.
So as you know, in the last few weeks, to bring us back finally to where we started, looking at these protests, for example, that are happening all over Europe and in America, is it not possible to see some of that religious impulse? It's not just that white privilege sounds a little bit like original sin. It's also, literally taking the knee is a religious gesture. There's been images of people having their feet washed. Isn't this a post-Christian secular movement, which is basically stumbling onto something like a kind of religious Christianity by accident?
Yeah, maybe. And I don't think that's all too bad. There's a lot of value in Christian theology. We don't have to throw it all away. There's a huge amount of value in the religious institutions and religious rituals. I don't know. I often think it's interesting that people who have become atheists, and often it's the only people who call themselves atheists have some kind of religious background themselves, because otherwise, why would you even call yourself an atheist? But then they still, and I experienced that and sensed that within myself, they still have sort of a yearning, or they miss some things about religion that they can't find in sort of cold secular society. But I think that is all solvable, and we can find different ways and different models.
Rutger Bregman, thank you so much for your time. That was fascinating. We covered a lot of ground in that short period.
Thank you. Well, these were great questions. Thank you.
And thank you for that. So that was Rutger Bregman, the Dutch writer and historian, talking about a lot of new ideas there and some old ones. That was Lockdown TV from UnHerd, and we'll be back tomorrow.